welcome the speakers and participants to this seminar and book presentation organized as part of the European Political Economy project of the European Studies Centre of St. Antony's College, University of Oxford. In particular, we welcome Scott James and Lucia Quaglia, who are presenting material from their book, The UK and Multi-Level Financial Regulation from Post-Crisis Reform to Brexit. Scott has been at the Department of Political Economy at King's College London since 2008. Much of his work has been in the area of political economy of financial sector policy. In this connection, from 2012 to 2016, he was principal investigator on the ESRC-funded project Voices in the City. And since 2016, been part of the UK research team for the Horizon 2020 EMU Choices project. In 2017, he held a visiting position, not so far from St. Antony's, at the Blavatsky School of Government, and he has numerous publications, including articles in leading academic journals, several co-authored with Lucia. Lucia Quaglia is currently professor of political science at the University of Bologna, and before then she was at the University of New York. She has been awarded research fellowships from various institutions such as the Hansa Wissenschaftskolleg, the Fonds National de Recherche, Scuola Normale Superiore. She chose numerous publications, including 7 books, 4 of which are from Oxford University Press. We welcome also Alex Lehmann from Breugel and Sam Lowe from the Center for European Reform, who have kindly agreed to be discussants, and I'll introduce them more fully in due course. First, logistics. We have 90 minutes. The presentations and then remarks from discussants, followed by questions and comments from the participants, where you can put your questions into the Q&A box, and I'll track those and convey them to the speakers. Note that the audience is being recorded. Before turning over to Scott and Lucia, I'd like to stress the importance and value of the book, UK Multi-Level Financial Regulation, which struck me when I was reading it. On the one hand, the formulation and implementation of financial sector policies have large effects, measured in billions of pounds and thousands of jobs and the welfare of millions of ordinary citizens. And certainly getting it wrong can be very costly indeed. So the topics addressed in the book matter a great deal. On the other hand, the study collects and uses empirical evidence with great care and great effect. They also have in fact assembled a panel data set with variations across time and across sectors, and also they recognize the variation across different agents, financial institutions, government regulators in different countries. This information set allows them to confront theories and predictions with very hard, concrete evidence. So to say that how the book addresses the chosen topics is also exemplary. With that, let me turn over to Scott, who start off before Lucia takes over.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for that introduction. Thank you very much for hosting this event, for organizing this event. We were just saying before, the book came out actually 5 or 6 months ago now, back in February, right at the beginning of the COVID crisis, and then all kind of got swept up in the sort of maelstrom that sort of swept across us. We had a book launch planned for April at King's. Unfortunately, that had to be cancelled. So this is actually the first opportunity we've had in a sort of event, organized event like this, to really talk about the book. So we're really grateful for the opportunity to do so and respond in particular to the discussants' comments. On that note, also great thanks to Sam and to Alex in advance for their comments and their questions about the book. We really appreciate the time that they've taken to have a look through the book and formulate their comments. Lucia and I are just going to speak very briefly, maybe for about 15 minutes or so, just give a very quick overview of the book, the key arguments, and a couple of cases that we look at in the book, but then obviously we'll come back to responding to the discussant comments and hopefully the Q&A afterwards. If you bear with me 1 second, I'm just going to share my screen because we have a couple of slides just to make life slightly easier. So I will share screen there. Okay. hopefully everyone can see that. I'm going to, unless anyone sort of shouts out, I'm going to assume the slides are working. So you see the book there, available in all good bookshops, all online retailers, as I say. So if you're interested in this particular topic, obviously we'd recommend having a deeper read of the book. The puzzle we address really looks at two particular aspects of the UK's post-crisis financial regulatory trajectory, if you want to sort of call it that. Going back to 2008, 2009, and really addresses sort of two puzzles and tries to bring it as up to date as possible. The post-crisis regulatory puzzle, in your like, which goes back to work that we've done over a number of years, looks at the sort of pre-crisis literature on UK financial regulation, which is embedded in a set of assumptions about the UK, really is favouring sort of low tax, lax regulatory framework for financing, the literature from the 80s and 90s on the City of London financial deregulation. And then there's a more up-to-date literature from sort of 2008, 2009, looking at how and why the UK has pursued much more stringent regulation in banking. We think, you know, that this is a really interesting line of inquiry. The particular puzzle, though, that we look at is the variation across different sectors of finance. So why you don't see this uniform approach to more stringent financial regulation, why there is this variation, why they've adopted more stringent regulation in some sectors like banking, but not in other words, in other areas like non-banking, particularly hedge funds, which we'll talk about. And then at the international and EU level, why UK regulators have supported greater harmonization, again, in some sectors, some areas, but they've actually been quite resistant to greater regulation at a higher level in other areas, and they seem to sort of prioritize more national level autonomy. So that's the sort of twin puzzle that we address. We also talk about Brexit. We have a lengthy closing chapter on Brexit, and really trying to apply the ideas and the analysis of the previous decade to trying to understand where the UK is in terms of Brexit and financial services, and what that might tell us about the post-Brexit regulatory framework, particularly in the UK and its relationship with the EU. So why has the UK decided to leave the EU single market in financial services? This great puzzle of why it seems to be doing all these things which, at least on the face of it, seem to be terribly detrimental to one of the UK's most important economic sectors. And as I say, looking to the future and thinking about what the implications might be for UK regulatory preferences and influence. The framework that we adopt, we try to do something different. This is, we try to move beyond comparative and international political economy approaches. In the book, we talk about why we think that they're inadequate for addressing these puzzles. The comparative political economy approach, because it doesn't say very much, firstly, about why the UK would pursue more stringent or market shaping regulation post-crisis. So there's actually relatively little sort of written on this from a comparative political economy perspective. We think that literature is still very much embedded in a pre-crisis mindset. But also from an international political economy perspective and a business power perspective, the emphasis there would be on the role of finance, transnational finance, big banks, big investment firms, shaping the nature of financial regulation, you would expect pushing the UK and resisting more stringent regulation, and particularly pushing the UK in a particular direction with respect to Brexit, which I'll talk about later. But that's precisely not what you say. So we argue, actually, we need a different approach here, which we label a domestic political economy approach, which is very much focused on what's going on at the domestic level and where financial regulatory preferences come from and how they're formed. The framework breaks down into two steps. Step one is looking at these three key actors in the formation of UK regulatory preferences. We look in detail at the role of elected officials, the role of financial regulators, and of course the role of the financial industry, the City of London in preference formation. We argue that each one of those groups has a distinctive set of preferences and incentives. So we might think about the way in which elected officials are particularly concerned about financial stability concern. They're concerned about voters and voters' demands for financial stability and pressure on elected officials to crack down on perceived sort of sources of instability in the financial sector. On the other hand, you've got the industry itself, which is very keen to protect its international competitiveness, the city's preeminent position in global finance. And then the distinctive aspect, I guess, we bring in is the role of regulators, because that traditional dilemma between trying to maintain financial stability on the one hand and international competitiveness on the other hand, this is fairly well established in the sort of global political economy literature. We argue that you need to bring in the role of regulators, and regulators can't be sort of seen as the passive recipient of preferences from voters or industry, and actually have their own very strongly held preferences. And they, of course, they have great expertise and knowledge to shape those preferences. In particular, regulators are concerned about cross-border externalities and managing those particular sources of risk. We suggest that this leads to two sets of preferences, either trading up or trading down. Trading up being pushing for much more stringent financial regulation, trading down, broadly speaking, being pushing for less stringent financial regulation. Step two then is, given those preferences and explaining UK preferences on that basis, how does this translate into the UK and international, the EU and international level? So we look at the strategies and influence of UK policymakers at that level. We talk about the way in which UK negotiators leverage various resources in international and EU negotiations with market power, i.e. the size of the city and the city's importance in particular financial sectors, regulatory capacity, the sort of respect, the expertise, the knowledge that UK regulators have in particularly in international regulatory fora. Domestic constraints alludes to Schelling's paradox of weakness. So this idea that if your hands are tied at home, you might have greater bargaining leverage at a higher level, at the international or EU level. And there are examples of this which we talk about in the book. And of course, alliance building, typically at the international level with the US and Switzerland, with whom they share a great deal of post-crisis regulatory preferences. This leads us to hypothesize sort of three outcomes in terms of influence or strategy, rather, that the UK negotiators pursue. Pace-setting strategy, where they're pushing for EU or international level harmonization of regulations. Foot dragging, where they tend to oppose or resist these higher level initiatives, or fence sitting, where they sort of remain largely indifferent and they focus more on domestic level regulation. So on that point, I will pause briefly and hand over to Lucia.
Thank you. So I will present the main findings of the book. And in the empirical research, we look at 5 case studies: capital requirements for banks, rules of bank resolution, rules on bank structure, hedge fund regulation, and regulation of derivatives, in particular central counterparties. And this table provides an overview of the UK role in shaping post-crisis financial regulation at the international level and at the European Union level. And we focus on 2 main aspects. The first one, whether the UK was a pace setter, a foot dragger, or a fence sitter, and whether the UK supported more stringent regulation and trading up of rules or resisted the trading up of rules. So starting off with bank capital requirements at the international level and at the European Union level as well, the UK supported more stringent regulation, but was a pace setter at the international level in the Basel Committee, whereas it was a foot dragger in EU negotiation on the Capital Requirements Directive 4. In the case of rules on bank resolution, the UK supported a trading up of rules and was a pace setter at the international level in the Financial Stability Board and at the European Union level. In the case of rules on bank structure, the UK was a fence sitter, so it promoted and implemented domestic reforms, but didn't sponsor European Union rules or international rules about the bank structure. And then in the case of hedge funds regulation, the UK resisted the trading up of rules and was a foot dragger at the international level in the IOSCO, International Organization of Securities Commission, and also the European Union level. In the case of derivatives, the UK supported the trading up of rules at the international level, where it was a pace setter, and also supported the resisted the trading up of rules at the European Union level, where it was a foot dragger. We now zoom in onto a couple of case studies, so we can move to the next slide. The first one is the case study of bank capital regulation. So our framework looks at the domestic level, the international level, and the European Union level. So at the domestic level, we look at three sets of players, regulators, elected officials, and the financial industry. So in the case of bank capital regulation, after the crisis, British regulators were in favor of more stringent capital rules and had the support of elected officials, whereas there was some pushback from the financial industry. At the international level, British policymakers were pace setters in promoting more stringent capital rules in the Basel Committee, in the so-called Basel III agreement, and were mostly successful in doing so, also forging an alliance with the United States. At the European Union level, British policymakers were foot draggers on the Capital Requirements Directive 4, and they resisted the treading down of international rules. They were only partly successful in doing so, partly because they were not able to forge coalitions with other member states. The second case study we would like to discuss in this presentation is almost specular to the case study of bank capital requirements, and it's a case of hedge fund regulation. So at the domestic level, British regulators had actually limited support for more stringent rules on hedge funds, and there was at the same time a strong pushback from elected officials and the financial industry, in particular hedge fund industry. At the international level, British policymakers were foot draggers in resisting more stringent regulation in the IOSCO, International Organization of Securities Commission, and were mostly successful in doing so, also forging an alliance with the United States. At the European Union level, British policymakers were foot draggers, and they tried to resist more stringent rules on alternative investment fund managers, and they were mostly successful in doing so because they were not able to forge a coalition with other member states, so were a bit left isolated on this issue.
Okay, thanks very much, Lucia. So I'm just going to finish very briefly with a couple of sort of thoughts on, of course, what I guess we probably will inevitably get onto to talking about is Brexit and what all this means for the UK's withdrawal from the EU and particularly for the City of London. So sort of alluding to Singapore on Thames there, that image, which I'll sort of talk about very briefly in a second. But what we do is apply our framework, our domestic political economy framework, to understanding the position that UK negotiators have taken since 2016. And we have quite a sort of lengthy story to tell about how and why the UK's preferences have been shaped on financial regulation in the way that they have. Just summarizing very, very briefly here, we can sort of set out the particular incentives and motives of the different key actors involved. So the elected officials, and this is a fairly sort of familiar story, elected officials, the Theresa May government at the end of 2016, of course, the Lancaster House speech in January 2017, makes it pretty clear that the government wants to end freedom of movement, and that in effect rules out continued single market membership. Okay, so the implications for the city from that point on are pretty huge, and that rules out a very significant policy space, which actually prior to that point, significant voices within the city had been pushing quite strongly for, the sort of continued single market membership option, or the EEA option, as it was also known. So that option is sort of closed down very early on in 2017. It's quite important to note that there were big, important institutions pushing for that, which we talk about in the book prior to the sort of Lancaster House speech. I think what's really interesting, I think what is less well known and less well talked about is the position of regulators, or certainly at that stage, who, contrary to, I guess, to significant sort of body of work in the IPE literature, have not pushed for automatically for regulatory continuity. What they've actually pushed for is regulatory autonomy. That's not the same as saying that they necessarily want to diverge from EU regulations in the future. But Bank of England regulators have made it very clear, Carney made it very clear very early on, that their priority, in a sense, was the ability to retain flexibility and discretion to vary financial regulation in the future for financial stability reasons. From a sort of bureaucratic politics perspective, this makes perfect sense. Regulators are looking to protect their autonomy. What they don't want to be are so-called rule takers from Brussels. I think we can talk about that distinction between rule maker and rule taker, and the extent to which is a false distinction, but that's certainly a way in which the narrative is very clearly framed. Industry hasn't been as unified as you might expect. There's a significant chunk of the city, the UK financial sector, which is either sort of broadly relaxed about the prospects of Brexit, or is actually not particularly animated by the prospect of Brexit because it doesn't necessarily impact on their particular business model. And actually, there's a significant chunk of the city, particularly the non-banking sector, the hedge funds, who are actually very keen on the idea of Brexit, to the extent that it might allow some rolling back of EU financial legislation in the future. Okay, so we talk about that. We talk about the different aspects, sectors of the city that have sort of pushed that. And we also talk about the extent to which the financial sector has had limited access to government, particularly during the first May period of office through to June 2017, where the Treasury was really sort of downgraded in terms of financial sector negotiations. A lot of the power shifted to number 10 around Theresa May and to DEX-EU around David Davis. And this had big implications for the city because, of course, its traditional channel of influence is through the Treasury. So those sort of Whitehall power games was quite causally significant. We also chart how industry's preferences have shifted significantly over time, originally pushing for the EEA option, or at least significant voices pushing for that option, then gradually coalescing around this idea of mutual recognition, treaty-based deal, a bespoke deal in financial services granting mutual access and mutual recognition of both regulatory regimes. We see this as kind of a compromise between different factions or different interests within the City of London, but this kind of worked to the extent that it held the sort of city's position together for quite a long time. The government eventually embraced that model more or less in early 2018, but then it was quietly sort of abandoned by mid-2018, and then you get the Chequers deal, which actually talks about something else. There's no mention of mutual recognition. You've got this gradual shift to what we call enhanced equivalence, other people have called super equivalence. But the idea is the future UK-EU relationship will be based on more or less the EU's existing third country equivalence regime, but from the UK's perspective, ideally with some improvements, with a stronger institutional dispute resolution framework. And then we talk a little bit in that chapter as well about how industry's strategy and influence has worked at the EU level, the fact that industry is kind of resigned now to the idea that, at least for the foreseeable future, there's sort of going to be a patchwork quilt of third country equivalence regimes. The fact that UK regulators may well start thinking about how they're going to influence EU regulation in the future, and we expect that to be through international alliance building, the way in which they'll try and sort of shape international standards as a way of indirectly influencing what's going on in Brussels. The final point there, and then I will stop, is alluding to the Singapore on Thames model. Okay, so the idea, or I guess people like Barnabas Reynolds have talked about a financial centre model, where you'd have more radical sort of divergence from EU regulation in the future, perhaps as a way of sort of attracting financial services back to London, as a way of compensating for some of the upheaval from a no-deal Brexit, relying on WTO rules, etc. I think it's very easy to rule that out. It's very easy to see that that option politically is incredibly difficult. Okay, and when we were writing the book 18 months ago, it seemed almost inconceivable. I think what I'd say now is, even in the midst of a COVID pandemic, is that we shouldn't rule that prospect out completely. I mean, nothing is inevitable in political science or political economy. So I guess this is something we can come back to in the Q&A. But I think it's just worth reflecting on the fact that regardless of where we are now, there are significant sections of the Conservative Party and significant sections of the city which would be very happy with that sort of a model and will go on pushing for that sort of model in the future. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see much more discussion of that in sort of 5 years from now. So I will pause there and we look forward to comments.
Thank you so much, Scott and Lucia. We now turn to our discussants. Alex Lehmann is a non-resident fellow at Breugel, the Brussels think tank, a consultant for Berlin Economics, a policy consultancy focused on Eastern Europe. Until 2016, he was lead economist at the EBRD and previously on the staff of the IMF and served as advisor to the World Trade Organization and the Central Bank of Mexico. He's also worked in research and teaching positions, say the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the LSE. He has a graduate degree in economics from the LSE and a PhD in economics from University of Oxford. So Oxford and IMF, it's a good combination. Sam Lowe is a senior research fellow at the Centre for European Reform. He's also a visiting research fellow at the Policy Institute of King's College London. They co-found the UK Trade Forum. He works on trade issues with focus on Brexit, customs and regulatory barriers, and trade and services. He regularly briefs businesses, government officials, politicians, and also European institutions, and is previously a member of the British government's Strategic Trade Advisory Group. He also often appears in the media, for example, the Financial Times, Politico, and The Economist. So both discussants are well versed in issues and bring academic rigor, some detailed policy expertise, and sensitivity to the political forces at play. So we start the discussion with Alex.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And more concretely, actually, I was at St. Antony, so real pleasure to be in this group and have an opportunity to comment on this book. Let me say, so I approach this from a little bit from the Brussels perspective. I think, you know, there are a huge number of issues going on around the recovery package. So financial services is maybe less central than it was 5-6 years ago, on which the book centers a period of intense rulemaking. Today, it is more of a refinement and ironing out many of the regulatory rulemaking that has been done over the past years. But I think it's safe to say the UK will be greatly missed, not just for loss of access to a financial center, but also exactly that issue of regulatory capacity and international networks that the UK contributed. Let me throw out 3 or 4 issues that are current in Brussels at the end of this year. One is the second phase of the CMU agenda. Of course, the UK was central when this all started in 2015. Today, it's a slightly more technical agenda around the recommendations of the high-level forum that published its report in June. But I think it's clear that the Commission struggles to gain much momentum within the member states and political backing for an agenda with an uncertain payoff, in particular in a crisis such as this one. Yeah? Other issues maybe would be in the regulation of so-called shadow banking, the non-bank financial sector, which has grown relative to banks, of course, accounts for nearly half the finance in the EU 27. And a third area is sustainable finance. Here, the EU tries to style itself as a international leader, not just in rulemaking, but also in generating new assets. Clearly, this originated from the Bank of England's work, but the EU is quietly trying to take over the leadership here. So I guess this all underlines that in many areas, the Commission, the supervisory agencies, ESMA in particular, will struggle to regain that same type of credibility and network access that UK brought to the table. So I learned a great deal from reading this book. I think it's really fascinating to see how regulatory strategies are formed. I think the 5 case studies, they're all really interesting and relevant. I could, as a quibble, maybe say that MiFID was conspicuously missing. That's of course a hugely complex area, but very much central to certainly the industry's complaints only 2 years ago. But I think it tackles a really central question that the book really makes the point well that there isn't a uniform regulatory approach to a strategy that cuts across all areas and all sectors. So the methodology adopts sort of stylized type of actors and strategies. I think that's helpful, and that takes you away from a sort of narrative of simply recounting how the agendas evolved. I think I would have been interested in a bit more of the stakeholders in the broader public, in particular the media and the UK House of Commons and Parliament, and how they scrutinized these strategies. I mean, there were very large-scale select committees on the costs of the financial crisis, how pre-crisis regulation had failed to check and contain the costs. I think one conundrum, to me at least, remains that despite the costs of financial bailouts and rescues, the scrutiny by civil society, both here in the UK, but especially so in the EU, is very limited. So it's only sort of the scandals when, say, a Wirecard financial services provider goes insolvent, when these types of organizations stick their head out. But in the normal run of things, I think the inputs on rulemaking are quite limited. So these stylized actors and strategies, they help to give a certain rigor to the case study analysis. I think ultimately elected officials are a very diverse set of actors, certainly in the EU. The rulemaking by the EU 19 or EU 27 is very diverse, very messy. That same type of common denominator would be very difficult to define. And regulatory strategies, I think it's interesting, and it's a really valuable contribution to see that in many areas the UK pushed for more stringent rules, and in others they actually held back. I think it would be interesting to have, for this table that you showed on your second slide, a bit more of a cost-benefit analysis. What were actually the anticipated risks from, say, I think they would be quite limited in the AIF, the Alternative Investment Directive, and of course very significant in the area of BRD and bank resolution. So maybe a bit more of a sense what the economic trade-offs were, and also how secure the UK felt in its competitive position of its financial center. That would shed a bit more light on how it arrived at these strategies. So I think one real question for the next few years will be how significant are the agglomeration effects around the financial center, such as the city here, or is this quite easy to replicate in a sort of more multipolar structure with several centers around the EU 27 taking up parts of the business from the city. So, I mean, we now see those sectors that lose the passporting rights move away to different parts of the EU, Dublin, Paris, Frankfurt, maybe to some extent. And the question is, what is the loss from these economies of scale and scope that the city used to have? Or was it a sense that UK regulators thought this is quite an unassailable position that gave them a bit more of flexibility in negotiating in the international forum? Then maybe one other point I would like to make is the UK approach to bank capital was certainly stringent by the standards of the time. It was less stringent by what many economists even back then argued is that the leverage ratio and the definition of new capital adequacy were actually quite timid compared to the excess of leverage that had been built up in the industry over the years. So some sense of how vulnerable is really the industry to further risks, and are we in a situation where the UK and other jurisdictions have built up a sector that is not just excessively leveraged, but also generating innovations that have questionable value, as Adair Turner said. And one area that's maybe related to that is that of bank governance, and to what extent the regulator and the supervisor here in the conduct regulation prevailed over the industry in forcing tighter, better conduct within banks. I think that's central to the type of risks and risk appetite these institutions have. That's normally a bit below the radar screen or below the headlines of rulemaking, but I believe it's central. But really, overall, I hope this book will be widely read, and I hope something similar will be produced for the EU, and it would bring much clarity to a process that's very opaque. And so thanks again for sharing this and giving me the opportunity to be part of this event today, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Alex. That was very insightful and careful, informed comments. Perhaps Sam, you'd like to add some remarks.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I really enjoyed reading the book, which is a slightly odd thing to say, I think, when you're thinking about a topic like this. As it's something you would often read for work, but you wouldn't necessarily think, well, I'm going to enjoy it. But I did, and I think one of the reasons for that is that it addressed, or at least attempted to address, a question that has sort of been lingering on my mind for a while, which is, why has the City of London been so ineffective in advancing its, at least on paper, interests over the course of the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years in the UK? And I think that's an important question, because it fundamentally, when you sort of acknowledge that they failed to do that, you start to question your entire understanding of how the British state operates, the relationship with business, and lots of other things as well. And actually, one of the bits that I appreciated most from reading this was your emphasis on the role of the regulator, because I think the focus has been on the city and its failure to deliver outcomes that, at least on paper, are beneficial to its interests. But the point you make about the regulator being its own actor within this ecosystem is one that I think has been nearly entirely missed from the Brexit discussion. It occasionally made its way into the Financial Times that Mark Carney had said something or other. But in terms of the general policy discussion around Brexit, the fact that the Bank of England did not want an EEA-style relationship because it valued its autonomy over short-term stability and economic prosperity is something that I think has been missed. And just to give an anecdote, I was at a dinner a few years back now with a very, very senior Bank of England official where they laid out this approach, the fact that they didn't want an EEA approach, and that they accepted this had short-term economic consequences, but they believed that retaining regulatory autonomy could allow them to defend themselves against future hypothetical economic crises that may never emerge. And we finally got the follow-up question of, well, what sort of crisis? What do you think this would stop you from doing? And this sort of interesting line was, it returned to the Basel arguments, which was, we would be worried that in the event of a future euro crisis, we'd be forced to assign a risk weighting of 0 to Portuguese bonds, when we would actually, and you suddenly start to retreat to early arguments that you've sort of addressed earlier in the book, where the UK potentially won out, or at least managed to advance its position. I think in terms of, so my slight criticism when it comes to how you've addressed the financial services industry, or at least the industry groups, in that I think you've been far too kind. I think you've sort of ignored some other elements that informed their lack of cut through. One being a sort of unbelievable arrogance that pervaded quite a few of their early interactions with member state governments, and also with the entire process. The idea that the EU would ultimately give the UK what it wants because they need us more than we need them. That was something you heard a lot. And I know from talking to diplomats that some of the early forays of the financial services industry and their meetings with member state governments were not well received. They were sort of, you have city representatives going into finance ministries and lecturing people. I know a story from when they went to Ireland, and the actual line was, a certain person said, well, we know this is all going to get sorted out, and the Irish border issue isn't a real one, right? And we'll just sort everything out on financial services. And these are not the sort of things that land very well. And the other thing I would note is that I think within the, at least industry groups, at least to begin with, there was a fundamental lack of understanding of EU trade policy and how that interacts with financial services, and what the scope for agreement is within those constraints. And the reason I sort of say a lack of understanding, and maybe just wishful thinking, is that in the end, the entire mutual recognition strategy, which I completely agree with you, came about ultimately as a compromise within the UK rather than something that was ever going to be sold to the EU, was that they hung it off a non-paper that was tabled in the 5th round of the TTIP negotiations, in which the EU maybe suggested to the US that maybe mutual reliance was something we should consider. And that sounds a bit like mutual recognition, but it was never quite clear that's what it was, because there's still also the talk of being able to unilaterally rescind access. And they built this entire structure on the basis of something that was incredibly flimsy and was never, ever going to be accepted by the European Union. And I suppose you mentioned it just now, Scott, in your presentation, but I'm not sure it really came through in the book, that fundamentally when you're thinking of the 3 actors and you're thinking about the officials, the constraint that ultimately means that the UK is not going to be in the single market, that the City of London's alternative ideas didn't work, is that the UK does not want to accept freedom of movement. And if the city wanted the same access to the EU's market as now the key to unlocking that discussion was accepting freedom of movement. And that's an argument that was lost with the Brexit vote, you could argue, and also past the Brexit vote, even when those different bodies were saying, well, we'd quite like EEA type membership, they were trying to concoct versions of that didn't involve freedom of movement, or had freedom of movement scaled back. And I do wonder if freedom of movement was something that could have been sold to the British public, if we could have had a slightly different discussion on financial services that maybe would have addressed some of the Bank of England concerns. Because I think people are a bit too literalist when it comes to discussing EEA membership. What the EU was offering the UK was not necessarily EEA membership. It was that balance of access and obligations, but the EU still wanted a bespoke structure to constrain the UK and deal with some of the areas where they felt the EEA membership offers Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein too much flexibility. And I do wonder if in that construct you could have had a scenario in which the prudential carve-out was brought in to the point, because that's not within the EEA agreement, and if that could have addressed some of the Bank of England's concerns that in a crisis it would have been constrained from acting, and that discussion could have been had. But of course, that discussion never was had and never will be. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. I note in this connection about sovereign risk rates that the UK has just had a downgrade, but perhaps Lucia and Scott would like to respond.
Yeah, shall I, Lucia, do you want me to go first?
Yeah,
I will.
You go first. Yes.
I will. There's some really good EU level points which Alex raised, which I might sort of leave to you. I guess I'll sort of focus on the UK, some of the UK points. But again, thanks very much to Alex and Sam for those really great comments. Thank you very much for reading the book again and saying what you liked about it and saying maybe what you didn't quite like as much, and maybe what we could have focused on slightly differently. But it's all really helpful and good to know. Alex, you make some good points. About the sort of longer term implications. I'm going to link that into something that Sam was talking about, what the future relationship might be. The CMU agenda, I'm going to defer to Lucia, and maybe Lucia can say something about that. In terms of the case studies, absolutely. I mean, it'd be great to have included MiFID. I mean, that we did consider that. It was going to be a big case. Obviously, we needed to make strategic decisions about which cases to include, which to not include. In the end, we sort of included the cases that we did because we wanted to try and have sufficient variation in terms of what we were explaining. So I guess that the MiFID case kind of would have fitted into one of those boxes where we already had a case. So we sort of left it out on those grounds. But inevitably, that means you're kind of leaving out some important post-crisis financial regulation. I also take the point about the importance of other stakeholders. Again, it would have been really nice to have talked about the wider ecology of stakeholders, particularly in the UK, shaping UK preferences, the role of Parliament and the media. That said, I'm not sure how much we'd have necessarily had to have, we would have been able to say, certainly for some of the cases. I guess the hedge fund case, we could have talked a bit more about some of the sort of wider groups which were organized around that. Certainly in the case of bank capital and the whole sort of backlash against the banking industry sort of post-crisis, there was a broader ecology, albeit relatively briefly, in that sort of period 2009, 2010, 2011. I think where those other cases do come in, of course, is the structural reform case. We do talk about the role of Parliament, which is really quite critical there. The role of the Independent Commission on Banking, and then the role of the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards. I guess that is the case where Parliament really does exert an important influence, basically in holding the government's feet to the fire and making sure that they follow through on the Vickers recommendations. And of course, then that has implications for what's possible at the international and EU level. Parliament's role there really pushes the UK in a particular direction, which makes it very difficult to imagine sort of coherent international or EU level coordination on structural reform. It's precisely why the UK ends up with that carve out for the Vickers reforms from the EU level process, which then subsequently collapses. I guess the other cases, there's nothing comparable to that. Although it might, as I say, it might have been interesting to talk maybe a little bit more about, as you say, some of the post-crisis investigations and commissions and select committee hearings on the crisis in the banking sector and too big to fail banks, and how that maybe shaped some of the debate. I also take the point about, the banking regulation actually how stringent is it? I guess the point we're making in the book is, yes, stringent relative to what was going on at the time and relative to the sort of discussions that were going on at the time and relative to what other countries were doing at that time in terms of bank capital and UK regulators pushing UK banks to hold higher levels of capital really than anyone else, certainly at that time. Sam, very briefly, yeah, too sort of generous when we're talking about the financial sector. Yeah, maybe we are. It's yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you in terms of the city's ineptness, I guess, when it comes to sort of its diplomatic skills, certainly early on in the process. When it comes to sort of engaging with other member states and national governments, I think it gets much better at doing that. But yeah, clearly, it lacks a sort of effective strategic response during those critical early months. I think it's surprising actually how quickly it takes for the city to get its act together. Really, I mean, it's kind of late 2016-17 before it's actually having a serious discussion, I think, about what its sort of preferences should be. I mean, to some extent, sure, that reflects the fact that there are divergent views within the city itself, but it also reflects the political vacuum. And I think this comes back to your fundamental point about how this really forces us to rethink the relationship between the city and the British state, and how easily that can become disconnected and dysfunctional as a result of electoral political upheavals like the referendum. I think what you see between the summer of 2016 and certainly early 2017, I guess, is the city being unable to respond effectively, really because of the political vacuum at the centre of the British state. The fact that the British government doesn't have a position on what it wants and doesn't really project a strategy in terms of what it wants in terms of financial services. So I think that tells you something interesting about how the city itself relies on the government to give it direction, to give it a strategic sense of what it wants, and how the city's preferences. This is kind of a paper I'm working on at the moment. How the city's preferences are very often co-produced with UK policymakers themselves and with senior UK politicians. And if senior UK politicians and policymakers don't have views on these things, then the city tends not to have views on these things, because there's this process of sort of strategic co-production going on. Yeah, maybe I'll pause there. Lucia, do you want to?
Okay, yes. So I would like to thank the discussants for their comments and insights. Just I shall pick up a couple of points. And the first one is about the so-called missing case studies. So as Scott mentioned, we thought a lot about what we should include or not. So I think also in the first draft of the book proposal, we wanted to include the regulation of credit rating agencies. And the rationale also, we were looking for regulation that took place at the European Union level as well as the international level. So credit rating agencies was an obvious case, but then we thought, okay, we have a word limit for the book, and if we in a way expand the number of case studies, we will need to be very concise in dealing with the case studies. The other potential case study we considered was Capital Markets Union. But again, our reasoning was there is no, if you want, to correspond to similar regulation at the international level. So that's why maybe Capital Markets Union is not the most suitable case to include. We also considered shadow banking, and for which there were a European Union level regulation as well as international regulation. But then we thought, okay, that's a huge field, and we are already dealing with bank capital rules, resolution, bank structure, hedge funds, and derivatives. So we decided sort of to leave some potential interesting case studies out. At a small point, it's a very fair criticism that we treat a little bit the European Union as a unified actor, not because we're not aware of the complexities of the European Union and different positions of member states and institutions. But then again, we were sort of trying to cover three different levels: the domestic one, European Union level, and the international level. So sometimes we had to be a bit concise in presenting the position of the different players at each level. And perhaps a point that was mentioned, the cases in which the UK was more influential at the European Union level were the cases in which the UK was able to at least try to form some coalitions with other member states, and vice versa, the case in which the UK was less influential in shaping European Union legislation. I think it's a case of hedge funds. It's a case in which the UK policymakers were very much isolated, not least because about 4/5 of hedge fund managers in the European Union were located in London, so other member states had different preferences, whereas on banker resolution, but also on EMIR, the UK was able to form some ad hoc coalitions with continental member states. And generally speaking, I would say in the making of European Union financial regulation, often the Netherlands, what we call the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, had actually some preferences that were similar to those of UK policymakers, and these were cases in which the UK was able to forge alliances at the European Union level and was therefore more influential in the shaping of legislation.
Maybe if I could just add one final thing, it's a really key point that Lucia made, which I made a note of sort of saying, I guess for those sort of wider audience that haven't read the book, I guess that's a key thing that comes out of the book in terms of the UK's relative influence at the international and EU level is very different. What comes out of the book is that the UK is much more effective and UK regulators are much more keen on being pace setters at the international level. I mean, they really love the international level. They love those global fora. They traditionally play a prominent role, particularly on the banking side. So and at the international level, again, because there's how those institutional frameworks operate, because they're relatively insulated from political pressures, of course, it allows them to play that sort of pace-setting role. And because you're talking about non-binding international standards, again, that's something that UK regulators are particularly keen on. It allows them to leverage all those resources that we talk about, market power, etc., regulatory capacity, alliance building with the US. When you then look at the EU level, so even when you're looking at the same financial sector or the same financial regulation, you see a very different picture. Then you see the UK's resources actually are far more limited. Market power very often isn't as effective. Regulatory capacity isn't as effective because you're operating in a very different environment. You're operating very often in a highly politicized environment. And that's where UK regulators, I think, are far less effective because they're constrained by that wider political context. And that's why the UK's record at the EU level is actually very mixed in terms of influencing post-crisis EU regulation. So I think that's a key point. It also hints at why UK regulators, I think, have taken the position they have since the referendum, why they're so keen on, and remember, Carney was initially talking about equivalence and using global standards as the reference point for, you know, some sort of conceivable UK-EU deal, which would use global standards as the reference point for that future relationship. You can see where that comes from a sort of bureaucratic politics perspective, precisely the fact that UK regulators think that they're far more influential at that level, and they have good reasons for thinking that. I think that tells you something about the future of how they're going to operate at that level as well.